Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling something really significant, getting a true sense of what depression feels like. We've been poring over an episode of a podcast called Depression Unplugged, what it feels like and how to cope. And, well, our goal is to move beyond just a surface understanding and really dig into the core experiences.
Right.
Many of you listening probably have either personal experience with depression or, know someone who does. So it's really vital to look beyond those simple definitions.
Absolutely. The way we often talk about depression, just in everyday conversation, it doesn't always capture the profound impact it has.
Exactly.
So this deep dive into the insights from Depression Unplugged should hopefully give us a much more detailed and nuanced picture.
Okay, so let's get right into it. According to the podcast, what does depression actually feel like? The first thing they really emphasize is that it's far more than just being sad. We hear that a lot, but what are the less obvious layers to this experience?
Well, what's particularly insightful in the podcast is how it sort of unpacks those layers. One of the initial feelings they describe is emotional numbness.
Numbness, yeah.
This almost complete lack of feeling where things that used to bring pleasure or interest, they just don't anymore. It's not necessarily a constant, intense sadness, but more of an absence,
Right, like a void.
Yeah, exactly. And interestingly, research suggests this can be linked to changes in how the brain actually processes pleasure and reward. Things that used to light you up might feel flat because those neural pathways just aren't firing the same way.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like the emotional vibrancy has just been drained away. And building on that, the podcast talks about overwhelming fatigue. Now, we all know what it's like to be tired, but this sounds like a completely different level.
Exactly. This isn't the kind of tiredness that, a good night's sleep just resolves.
Right.
It's a persistent, deep exhaustion that can make even the smallest tasks feel like climbing a mountain. It's a fatigue that often just sticks around no matter how much rest you get.
And that deep fatigue often has a knock-on effect, doesn't it? On our drive and energy to do things, which leads us to another key feeling the podcast highlights: loss of motivation. This isn't just putting things off. It sounds like a real struggle to even start basic daily activities, like getting out of bed or preparing food.
Yeah, and this loss of motivation can be especially hard for those who haven't experienced depression to really grasp. It can be mistakenly seen as a lack of willpower, when in reality, it's a fundamental symptom of the condition. The podcast also brings up the very difficult experience of self-doubt and guilt.
Yes, that really resonated. The feeling of being a burden or constantly blaming yourself for things that often aren't even your fault creates this incredibly negative internal monologue.
It becomes a kind of vicious cycle, really. The depression itself can fuel these negative thoughts, which in turn can, unfortunately, deepen the depression.
Yeah.
And often connected to this internal struggle is the withdrawal from social interactions.
Right. Even wanting to pull away from people you really care about, your friends and family. It's not necessarily that the desire for connection vanishes completely, but the energy and emotional capacity to engage can be just totally depleted.
And the podcast makes a really crucial point here, something vital for everyone to understand. Depression isn't always obvious from the outside.
That's so important.
Someone might appear to be functioning, going to work, seeing people, while internally they were facing this huge battle.
That's such a key takeaway. We really can't always judge by outward appearances. And if any of these feelings we've been discussing sound familiar to anyone listening, the podcast explicitly says that your feelings are valid and you are not alone in experiencing them. That's a powerful message.
Absolutely. Recognizing these many different facets of how depression feels is the crucial first step towards both understanding it and being able to offer meaningful support. Now, the podcast then transitions to addressing some really widespread myths and misconceptions about depression, which is so important for tackling the stigma that unfortunately still surrounds it.
Exactly. Because these misunderstandings can stop people from seeking the help they need, or can lead to comments that, even if they're well-intentioned, can be really unhelpful and even hurtful. One of the biggest myths they take on is the idea that depression is just sadness.
And as we've already sort of touched on, the podcast firmly refutes this. It emphasizes that depression is a serious mental health condition that affects not just your mood, but also your energy levels, even your physical health. It's a much broader and more impactful condition than simply feeling sad for a bit.
Right. It's systemic in a way.
Yeah.
Another really damaging misconception that the podcast addresses is that you could just snap out of it. This completely ignores the very real biological and psychological factors at play, doesn't it?
It does. And what's insightful here is how directly the podcast tackles this. They point out that if it were that simple, well, no one would be struggling with depression, right?
Good point.
It's not a matter of just deciding to be happy or a simple change in mindset. It often requires time, support, and sometimes professional intervention. When we say biological factors, we're acknowledging that, changes in brain chemistry can play a significant role, making it far more than just willpower.
And then there's the incredibly harmful belief that only weak people get depressed. Ugh, this adds such an unnecessary layer of shame and stigma.
The podcast rightly counters this by stating very clearly that strength has absolutely nothing to do with it.
Nothing.
Depression can affect anyone, regardless of their background, perceived strength, success, personality. It's an illness, not a reflection of someone's character.
Absolutely. And finally, they address the fear that talking about it makes it worse. This is such a significant barrier for so many people who are struggling in silence.
The podcast offers a really important counterpoint here, explaining that actually talking about depression can be the very first step on the path to healing. Silence can often breed and, intensify feelings of isolation. Opening up, even to just one trusted person, can be a crucial lifeline.
It really is about breaking down these walls of misunderstanding, isn't it? Which leads us nicely to the final section of the podcast excerpts, practical coping strategies and how to seek help. If someone listening is experiencing any of the feelings we've discussed, what are some initial steps they can take according to this source material?
Okay, so the podcast provides several really practical and actionable strategies. The first, and perhaps most vital, is simply to talk to someone. This could be a therapist, a trusted friend, a supportive family member, maybe a support group. The very act of sharing your experience can be incredibly validating and can immediately start to reduce that intense feeling of isolation we talked about.
And on days when things feel completely overwhelming, the podcast suggests focusing on small wins. I really like this idea. It's about acknowledging and celebrating even the seemingly minor accomplishments.
Absolutely. On a day when simply getting out of bed feels like an enormous task, actually managing to do it is a significant victory.
Right.
Recognizing these small steps can help build a sense of momentum and counteract that feeling of being completely stuck. The podcast also strongly emphasizes the importance of practicing self-compassion.
This feels particularly important given the self-doubt and guilt that often come with depression. It's about being kind and patient with yourself, acknowledging that experiencing depression is not your fault and you deserve understanding, like treating yourself with the same level of kindness you'd offer a friend going through something tough.
Exactly. Another strategy the podcast mentions is trying movement. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean pushing yourself to do intense workouts. The podcast specifically highlights gentle forms of exercise, stretching, going for a walk, maybe practicing yoga, emphasizing their potential to gradually improve mood over time. Even small amounts of physical activity can release endorphins.
Those feel-good chemicals.
Right, those natural chemicals in your brain that can have a positive effect on your mood. The key here is finding movement that feels manageable and sustainable, rather than adding more pressure.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
The podcast also recommends creating a routine, which, seems logical, especially given how depression can really disrupt your sense of normalcy and structure. Having even a simple daily routine can provide a much-needed sense of stability and predictability.
Precisely. It can help to counteract the sort of chaotic feelings that depression can bring and provide a framework for getting through daily tasks, even when motivation is really low.
Yeah.
The podcast also touches on the importance of limiting isolation.
Even when you really don't feel like being around other people. Making small efforts to stay connected with loved ones can be genuinely beneficial.
Yeah, this could be as simple as a brief phone call, sending a quick text message, or even just being in the same room as someone you trust. It's about consciously trying to maintain those connections, even in small ways, to actively combat the urge to completely withdraw.
Got it.
And finally, and perhaps most importantly, the podcast strongly emphasizes seeking professional help.
This includes considering therapy and, when appropriate, medication. The podcast is really clear about destigmatizing, seeking this kind of support. It's absolutely a sign of strength and self-awareness, not weakness.
Absolutely. Mental health professionals have the specialized training and expertise to provide effective treatment and support. The podcast rightly underscores that everyone's experience with depression is unique, and finding personalized strategies that work for you is key. But the overarching crucial message is clear. You do not have to face this alone.
So to kind of bring all of this together, our deep dive into Depression Unplugged really shines a light on the fact that depression is a deeply complex experience that goes far beyond just feeling sad. It can involve that emotional numbness, overwhelming fatigue, a profound loss of motivation, crippling self-doubt, social withdrawal, and importantly, it's not always visible to those around us.
Right.
We've also unpacked some really harmful and persistent myths and reinforced the vital importance of seeking help and utilizing practical coping strategies like talking to someone, focusing on small wins, practicing self-compassion, trying gentle movement, creating routines, and actively working against isolation.
The core message from this really valuable source material is just so important. If you are currently struggling with depression, please know that you are not isolated in this experience, and effective help is absolutely available. There are definitely pathways towards healing and recovery, and taking that initial step to reach out for support is truly an act of courage.
And on that note, if anything we've discussed today has resonated with you, please do reach out for support. That could be as simple as talking to a trusted friend, a supportive family member, or seeking guidance from a mental health professional. Maybe consider this. What might be one small, manageable step you could take today, either for yourself or perhaps to offer support to someone you know who might be struggling? It's often in those first small steps that the journey towards greater well-being truly begins.